As long as I can remember, students have been complaining about poverty.
The student loan system is one of the most flawed inventions even by this government.
Students should not be seen as people in hardship and in need of benefit. They're people pursuing an education who need to be adequately funded.
Is Britain's higher and further education system approaching crisis? Many people think so. Increased student numbers, coupled with reduced state funding, have brought the system close to breaking point. In the light of this, the government has announced a cross-party inquiry chaired by Sir Ron Deering to investigate the future size, shape and funding of the system. The report will be published in the summer of 1997 and will be one of the first major reports to face a new government. Deering's findings, however, may not be implemented until the millennium, and the question facing the higher education sector is whether both students and the institutions will be able to endure without disastrous consequences for both education and for the future economy of the country.
The government has allowed the numbers of students in the system to increase without any comparable increase in the funding. We, therefore, were always wanted to have such an inquiry, and frankly, we welcome the fact the government's caught up with our thinking on that.
The inquiry into higher education, initiated by the government and chaired by Sir Ron Deering, will undoubtedly be vital in planning the future of further and higher education. But the system just now is in crisis. Many institutions are faced with redundancies or cutting resources, but they're unwilling to come out, they're unwilling to be honest about that for fear of putting off students from actually entering into their courses.
The ancient Scottish universities are unique in having a rectorial system. Every 3 years, the student body elects a rector whose job it is to fight the student cause, both in the university court and elsewhere.
Generally speaking, of course, most students' problems boil down to one thing and one thing only, and that's money. Money for rent, money for substance, you know. And that's not something a rector can easily do much about. But one can fight as hard as one can.
It's a Euro rocket, isn't it?
It's a Euro rocket.
It costs billions and billions of francs. It should be spent on putting some books in our universities.
Is this being said in your capacity as rector of Glasgow University?
Yes, it is.
Right.
I think it's shocking that students have to queue for books for 4 hours. You don't get a book out for 4 hours, for God's sake. It's disgraceful.
I realise that there are problems of funding and all the rest of it, but coming in as an outsider, I'm astonished at the lack of facilities that are available and the amount of hardship there is amongst students.
In total, I owe £3,000 to the student loans company, £800 to the bank and £500 to the university, which I have to pay back before the end of this month, otherwise I can't graduate. Even though I get a full grant, the rent that I pay on my flat comes to more than the amount I get per term for my grant. I pay £170 a month on my flat. I think I worked it out once and I'm left with about £2 at the end.
Most of my colleagues are astounded to be told that the basic rent now in Pollock Halls, the residences at the University of Edinburgh, are more than a basic grant. So even if you're on a full grant, you still can't afford the rent for the whole year. You've got to be supported elsewhere.
Some students have been forced to go to extremes to make ends meet.
Your parents are responsible for you until you're 25 if you're in full-time education. And I don't really like having to take that sort of legal steps like that to sort of get money. I'd much rather rely on myself. You know, I'd much rather not have that kind of sort of impetus to do that. But, you know, the situation as it is that it has to be done. So I'm pursuing my father through the courts to get aliment from him because basically I need every penny I can get.
The Student Loans Company estimates that £3.1 billion have been borrowed by students since loans were introduced in 1990. 2.9 billion remain outstanding. Based on 1995-96 figures, it was estimated that the average student needed £4,145 living expenses per annum. A maximum of £3,275 per annum was available through grants and loans, leaving a shortfall of £870. The difference could be made up through commercial loans and employment. Otherwise, after a 3-year course, the shortfall would be £2,610. Including loans, a student without access to other income would graduate with a total debt of £7,830. Many courses run for longer than 3 years, thereby adding to this debt. Compared to an unemployed individual claiming income support and housing benefit, a student on a full grant would receive approximately £2,000 per annum less.
There isn't enough money, clearly, available to students at the moment. Even if you take the grant and loan together, it's less than many students could get if they were unemployed and claiming benefit. For many, that's a bizarre choice, either to be unemployed and not training, or to be in education and actually suffering financially because of it. We have to reverse that situation. We have to provide enough resources for students to get through, not overly comfortably, but get through during their course with the ability to study and the ability to concentrate on academia rather than on trying to make ends meet.
Students, when they're not entitled to benefits, as well as 16 and 17-year-olds, are treated really as non-people. They have no entitlements, and it's very, very important that there is a safety net to make sure that we don't see these types of hardship.
Hardship and debt are not the same thing. And there is an unpalatable fact, at least unpalatable, as I find, to student audiences, which is that we actually give more support to students to pursue their higher education than any other Western industrialised nation.
Students are coming out with an accumulated student loan over a 3 or 4 year course of £4,000, £5,000, £6,000, and possibly a commercial debt on top of that of another £3,000, £4,000 or £5,000. So you're talking about an accumulated debt of maybe £10,000 or £12,000 for some students, which is an awful lot to have to carry through before you get any kind of gainful employment. And naturally, for an awful lot of students, it means that they start their life off as a level of debt that most people in their 20s would hope never to have to undertake, and if they were doing it, it would be to buy a house or in other ways to set themselves up, not just to complete their education so they can start working and earning money.
The assumption of the government is that all students are people who are young people living at home with parents who are going to feed and clothe them. The real world isn't like that.
Unlike students in most other Western countries, students in Britain tend to study away from their homes. This greatly increases their expenditure. A grant from the government is given to some based on personal or parental income to cover the cost of books, food, accommodation and other essentials. At most, this is well under £2,000.
£2,000 sounds like a lot of money, but it's not when you consider that rent, you could be paying anything up to sort of £190 a month. That's even in like university accommodation. And if you're paying that for like 12 months, then, you know, your grant is long gone. Plus, usually, half of your grant sort of for the first term goes on paying your summer overdraft over. Because even if you've got a job, it's pretty difficult to sort of live on that money as well as sort of clear your debt from the previous year. So it's kind of a bit of a vicious circle. I've got about £4,000 worth of student loans. I've had one every year. If I didn't have them, then I would have dropped out of university, because the money that you get is so minimal, it barely covers sort of your living costs.
The student loan system is one of the most flawed inventions even by this government. First of all, it provides inadequate support. Secondly, it triggers repayments when the student may have an income well below average income, and when that same person, young person, just graduated, is setting up home, starting out in life, least able to afford to make the repayments. Thirdly, it actually is costing the state an enormous amount of money, because the level of bad debt in the system, if they're honest, is very high indeed. Indeed, you could argue that we're spending more on the student loan scheme to provide less support for the students.
They should be allowed more, and they should be able to pay it back more slowly, because it's no good somebody freshly armed with a degree suddenly owing their government £20,000, you know, having to pay it back in a fortnight or go to prison.
The problems caused by the system of student loans have made the Deering report an important political issue. Public opinion is divided and increasingly important.
Well, I think it does have advantages in that students perhaps are more aware of the fact that somebody is paying for their education, and perhaps encourages them to be more responsible about their own personal economies.
If things don't change in Cambridge, we're going to go back to the 20s, where it's only the very rich students who can afford to come here.
I think it's a disgrace that they have to get loans. I mean, why don't they go back to the old grant days, like they used to do? Students are poor in these days as well, but I don't think they were as poor as they are today.
Lack of money to cover basic living costs can often be the cause of both physical and emotional illness, affecting students' ability to concentrate properly on their studies.
A recent survey NUS conducted with the NatWest Bank found that 1 in 3 students are failing to eat properly. They cannot afford the meals they need whilst they're trying to study. That's the reality of student hardship in the 1990s. The problem of student accommodation has become a crisis too. Rents are increasing, yet the money available to students has not. That's led to more and more students forced into substandard accommodation. Student health is suffering for a variety of reasons. Students are being expected to pay their own prescription charges as well as pay for their eye and dental checks. The lack of money means that student health is suffering because of accommodation and food problems. And in addition, student support services provided by institutions are being cut because of the lack of money from central government. That leads us to a situation where more and more students are dropping out because of health problems, and more are suffering through education rather than being able to study to their full potential.
It is not only substandard accommodation and lack of nutrition which affect academic study. Part-time work is now an important factor, and most students have to work at some time during term time. According to a survey conducted by the NatWest Bank and the National Union of Students, 10% of students questioned worked over 20 hours a week, 10% earning less than $2.50 an hour. A further 20% of the students surveyed wanted to work but were unable to find a job. Students have always worked, but never in such vast numbers as now. A recent survey published in the Scotsman newspaper found that in 1981, 28% of students were in or looking for part-time employment. In 1995, this figure had risen to 78%.
What is terrible now is that the financial pressures are such that, of course, students have to work during the vacations, and not just during the vacations, they have to work often during the time when they're supposed to be studying as well.
The present students are being forced into debt. They're being forced to take jobs, probably very low-paid jobs, with long hours, unsocial hours, and these are not the sort of conditions in which young people should be studying.
I'm at drama school in Cardiff, doing a 3-year degree, and the hours that I do are quite long. At the moment, I think we're timetabled from 9 every morning until, on average, probably about 8. But rehearsal-wise, it can be sort of much later. We've worked through to like 10 before. And we're sometimes called on Saturdays as well. My parents can't sort of give me any support at all. And with the money that I get from grants, I've had to work. I mean, I've sort of accepted the fact that I've got to work in order to sort of have the things that I want, but also just basically live well and feed, make sure I've got food and pay off bills and whatever. But I think we've all got to accept that at the end of the day, the students have got to pay for their own education, similar to what's happening in the United States. You can't argue against that. It's just something that's happening.
As long as I can remember, students have been complaining about poverty. They used not, I think, to complain so much about working to supplement their student income. Most people in my day, which admittedly is a very long time ago, used to enjoy it. And with unemployment falling so fast, indeed faster than in any other European Union nation, there can be no complaint about unavailability of jobs. There are some areas in this country where actually there's negative unemployment at the moment. There can't be a problem.
Now, in some parts of the country, some students can get vacation jobs, but it's a myth to pretend that all students in all parts of the country can get vacation jobs. And of course, if you stay in an area where there may be jobs, you have to find residences, you have to find housing, and that's catch-22, because it was housing benefit that was done away with. So if you then go home to your parental home, which might be in a rural area, there might not be any job. So it's students do make heroic efforts to find resources, but some of them simply can't find resources in the summer, and then they go further into debt. And I think none of us welcome student debt. It's just a millstone around people's necks.
I've had more jobs at university than I care to count. Yes, I've worked a lot since I came to university, basically since the beginning of first year. First of all, I wasn't sort of working that much. It was just the occasional sort of day or two in a sort of cafe. But now I'm working about 30 hours a week on average. In the 2 weeks before my exams, I was having to work 40 hours a week because my grant had long since gone and there was bills coming in, and basically I was working to live.
Financial burdens faced by students often reach beyond the university or college. As individuals juggle finances and employment, many find the need to turn to their families for assistance, which often proves difficult.
You can see a fairly clear distinction now between students whose parents are able to help them financially and those students whose parents can't. And since one of the purposes of higher education is to admit people on merit and only on merit and not on the basis of their financial resources, obviously all of us are very concerned about financial pressures on those from the least financially favoured backgrounds, something we worry about a great deal.
What we've seen at universities like this one is a tremendous pace of change and the extent to which there's growing divisions within the student body. I'm quite concerned about the issues of, well, we call it polarisation. For a substantial proportion of the student body, difficult to say how many, 30, 40% I suppose, the change hasn't meant all that much. Their parents were always going to be able to afford to send them into higher education. Then there's a clump in the middle for whom things are pretty tough, for whom parents are making considerable sacrifices. You've got to remember that if you're an 18-year-old coming to university, like as not, you've got a brother or sister who's 20 or 16, and so there's great pressure on families to send, if they're all sending their children to university. Then if there's this clump in the middle for whom things are tough, there's an increasing proportion of students for whom things, I think, are actually just becoming impossible. I find it quite disheartening that large areas of this university doesn't appreciate that probably about a third of all undergraduates are working for money in term time. They're going out to work in, frankly, not terribly good jobs. The best work will be shop work, but many of them are working as care assistants, they're working as cleaners, they're working unsocial hours in bars, particularly in cities like Edinburgh. This means that we can't really assume that they're fully available for their studies, even in term time.
Throughout my 4 years at university, I've worked pretty much full-time. I worked all first year in a restaurant in the centre of Aberdeen, and then the last 3 years in a pub. I do between 25 and 35 hours a week, sometimes more, sometimes less, depending on how much work I've got.
It is very unhealthy for students to have to take on part-time work to support themselves through university or through any other form of degree course. It is very important that they should be able to focus full-time on their studies, particularly since those studies in many ways are more demanding than they were before.
The experience of going to university shouldn't just be about achieving course levels and all the rest of it. It should be, and also, if it's to be a proper learning experience, it should be, they should be free of any anxieties about money. I know this is rather an idyllic idea, but that's what university should be about.
I believe that opinions are beginning to vary quite a lot about whether people want the luxury of a full 3-year course with all the extracurricular activities that there are, and the character building and the growth that allows, and others who say, look, I want a degree, I want it fast, I want to spend 15 months on this and then I want to get out and earn.
The value of a university education has often been debated. Benefits of a personal and social nature are seen by some to be as essential to students and future employers as academic qualifications. The government has suggested cutting the length of degree courses, thus reducing the financial strain on both state and student. But these advantages must be balanced by the quality of the graduates and the other broader cultural skills that are necessary in a competitive economy.
The whole point about a student life is that it should be a bohemian one in which you do have fun and you've got enough to drink. It's not enough just to be able to buy pasta and pizzas and things like that. You've got to be able to drink. I mean, my God, if students can't drink, you might as well just pack up and forget the whole business. I mean, it's what it's about. It's where people learn to drink. It's where they learn all the fun things in life.
There is a considerable amount of what we would see as rather unpleasant and antisocial behaviour. And in fact, there's all the evidence that what you have here is a population under stress. There is a surprising amount of heavy drinking. I mean, I know students have always been thought of as heavy drinkers, but people who are formally, professionally informed in this area think that this is now getting beyond what it used to do in the past. I think what there is an enormous amount of binge drinking. I don't think students are in the pubs all the time.
It really annoys me when I sort of hear of people who are against students because they sort of think they're sort of lazy and they sort of just out drinking every night and whatever, because, I mean, some students might be like that. Some courses might sort of have the space that you can sort of party all the time, whatever. But they're not all like that. And some of us work damn hard to get the money that we need to live on.
The situation could become worse if universities and colleges, in their own financial difficulties, begin charging entrance fees. Regardless of Sir Ron Deering's findings, it's estimated that changes could take up to 5 years to implement. For this period, students will face continuing difficulties increased by rising living expenses. It's claimed that without sufficient investment, future graduates would lack many of the academic and social skills required in the workplace.
If one looks at it fairly historically, one will find that there is always student disquiet about the burdens they feel that are placed upon them and what the state can do to support them. But it is important, it's a very, very important sector, and I believe in supporting it simply because of the contribution that it and its products, the graduates, make to the economy and to the richness of our country. You're never going to get a perfect system. People will never be wholly satisfied with it, for those who have to pay and those who receive. But the importance of the sector can't be denied, and we need a balance between support given and contribution made.
If you cut back on your spending on your higher education, if you reduce the investment of the nation in qualifications and skills of the next generation, then you pay a very heavy economic penalty, which loses you an awful lot more than you save from the cuts.
The fact that the government have recognised that there was a sufficient problem to require Ron Deering to look into it is obviously welcome. But it's interesting, isn't it, that the government have decided that Sir Ron should report in 1997, which of course means after the next election, and that's given them and sadly the Labour Party an excuse not to address the issues that students are facing today. So whilst it may be helpful in the long run, it doesn't do anything for students who are in the middle of their courses now and facing genuine difficulties.
I think that the Deering inquiry and whatever changes are implemented immediately afterwards are probably the last opportunity to avert either a crisis or radical changes in the way British higher education is funded.
Many students and academics believe that higher education in Britain is in crisis, a crisis of funding, with too many students unable to make ends meet and forced to start their working lives heavily in debt. Even when the Deering inquiry has made its recommendations, it may be several years before they're implemented. Many people in education see Deering as a last chance to introduce vital reforms. If the next government misses that chance, they say, the future of Britain's higher education will be bleak indeed. with all the consequences that that would mean for the country itself.
If our universities find themselves cutting back all the time, then we're going to have an impoverished society ultimately.